Hi, my name is Emma Lockhart, and this is my presentation for MGF2656. This is a brief overview of my presentation, and for context, Hotel Oz is looking to expand to. So I'm going to go over a brief summary of Japan. So firstly, Japan is situated in the continent of Asia. Its neighbours, as can be seen in the right image, include Korea, China, and Russia. Secondly, the population of Japan as of Saturday, the 26th of September, is just over 126 million. Females make up the majority of the population, and the life expectancy is approximately 82.3 years, and the median age is approximately 46.3 years. Thirdly, I'm going to discuss facts relevant to employment and income in Japan. About 75% of those in Japan, aged between 15 and 64, have a paying job. The average wage in Japan is about 53,000 AUD, and there is a gender wage gap between men and women. Japan is also known for its seniority-based wage system, which will be discussed later. And lastly, 2/3 of households in Japan are dual income earners. Lastly, I'm going to briefly explore the culture and society elements of Japan. Firstly, those who participate in religion, it is mainly Buddhism and Shinto. There is also some Christianity though. Secondly, family structures are moving to being more nuclear family households. Thirdly, there is a heavy focus on education in Japan. The system is seen to be quite grueling by Western standards. And lastly, Japan is considered to be a more collectivist culture by Western standards. This section relates to labour regulation environment within Japan. The Japanese employment laws are similar to Australians in some aspects. For example, Japan and Australian law dictates a maximum number of hours an employee can work in a week. For Japan, it is 40 hours, and in Australia, it's 38 hours. However, they also do differ in other aspects. For example, in Japan, according to OECD, there is no time frame as to when employers can make a claim of unfair dismissal. However, in Australia, these claims must be made within 21 days. Overall, it can be distinguished that in comparison to other countries, Japan has a relatively strict employment protection process. Another example of employment protection law differences can be seen in severance pay. In Japan, the OECD found that severance pay is not legally required in Japan. However, in Australia, this pay is required. Overall, Japan provides extensive labour laws for protection for its workers. An example of these extensive laws is that Japan doesn't have at-will determination of employees. There is a rigid system for protection of employees that is just and fair. This section discusses the labour market characteristics of Japan. Firstly, in Japan, people often stay in the same job until they retire. Lifelong employment is common. Secondly, traditionally, people in Japan work much longer working hours despite the maximum working hours. They often do a lot of overtime or work without pay. Moreover, women are more likely to be involved in part-time work than men. And finally, Japan has an aging workforce. The next section will discuss HRM challenges. The first one is work culture in Japan. So there's 3 parts to this. The first part is the work culture in Japan relevant to work hours. The Japanese are known for very long working hours, relevant to the desire to achieve. This has shown to heavily impact mental health. This graph shows the number of hours worked overtime in Japan in comparison to Australia. As you can see, in Japan, it's much higher. The next part of Japanese work culture that impacts on HRM is the formality. The Japanese are seen to have a very formal work culture, whereas Australians are often more casual. In a study, Japanese were observed to be more disciplined in nature and viewed as being strict. This also relates to the importance of reporting and information sharing in Japanese work culture. This way of communication in Japan is known as horenzo and involves the 3 steps of report, communication, and consultation. It basically refers to the act of constantly sharing information and reporting to colleagues. This may seem really time-consuming to outsiders. The final aspect of Japanese work culture is relationships with co-workers. It is seen very common for co-workers to be expected to party or hang out with co-workers after hours. It's seen as a method to go up the ladder in a company and build relationships. So what does this difference in work culture mean? It means that there is a need to complete cross-cultural training. Ideally, an experiential or immersion approach will be ideal, where there's things like simulations and cultural sensitivity training involved. It's been noted that this kind of a training improves the performance of expatriates. The second challenge to HRM I will discuss is about national culture. Whilst we have seen differences with work culture, there's also differences and maybe some similarities in national cultures between these countries. To help explore this, we'll be using Hofstede's framework. I will be going over each of these dimensions. This diagram shows an estimation of where Australia and Japan lie on the dimension. So firstly, power distance. Power distance refers to whether the country embraces a hierarchy, encourages bureaucracy, and if there is a high level of respect regarding rank and authority. As we can see this diagram on the left, Japan has a higher level of power distance than Australia. It has been noted that in Japan, people accept inequality of power and the existence of a tall hierarchical structure is common. However, this rating is still lower in comparison to other Asian countries. The second dimension is individualism versus collectivism. In individualistic societies, people are more self-invested and think of themselves. In contrast, collectivist societies are where people place more value on the group and group interests. As we can see on the graph, Australia is a highly individualistic society. This brings up the question about how do we reward and conduct performance management with this difference. People in Japan might be more used to being rewarded as a group rather than individual. The third dimension is masculinity versus femininity. This refers to whether a society is more masculine in nature, where it focuses on power, success, and material rewards, or a society is more feminine in nature, where it looks at the nurture of citizens and quality of life. This graph indicates that Japan is much more masculine in nature. They're tough in nature and more performance orientated. The fourth dimension is uncertainty and avoidance. This means whether rules dictate and there is a strong formal structure, or society is more willing to tolerate ambiguity and take risks. Whilst Australia has a moderate level of uncertainty avoidance, Japan has a very high uncertainty avoidance. It's been noted that the Japanese dislike taking risks and prefer stability in work and in their life. The fifth dimension is long-term versus short-term orientation. This means whether society focuses on the long term and looks to the future, or if they're short term and want instant gratification. As we can see on the graph, the Japanese are much more interested in not only looking at today's success, but ensuring for the success of future generations, whilst Australians are looking for instant gratification and living in the moment. The final dimension is indulgence versus restraint. This relates to whether society is more indulgent in nature, i.e. do people look to fulfill their desires and impulses, or if society is more resistant in nature, i.e. do people control and curb their desires. As can be seen from the graph, Australians are more likely to indulge and therefore are more optimistic as a society, while Japan are more likely to curb impulses and can be more pessimistic as a result. So we can bring all these dimensions together and look at what this means for HRM. So firstly, the differences in culture may create tension. For example, Australians may see the higher power distance culture in Japan as being unfair and undemocratic. Secondly, Hofstede's dimensions indicate a need to adjust a performance management system. For example, those in the collectivist culture, i.e. Japan, are more familiar with group rewards, whereas those in the individualistic culture, i.e. Australians, are more familiar with individual rewards. Moreover, Japan is more long-term orientated, so they may only be motivated if things are relevant to the future, whereas Australians are more short-term orientated, so they may need instant gratification. Overall, HRM needs to learn how to motivate both groups and adjust their performance and management systems to reflect the different cultures. Thirdly, Hofstede's dimensions indicate the performance of cross-cultural training It can help to familiarize both home and host countries' employees with respective cultures, traditions, and habits. For example, exploring the tough and non-nurturing nature of Japan due to their high masculinity to Australians. There are two other relevant considerations that I will discuss. The first is language. There is a difference in language between the countries. This may result in communication issues. There could be gaps in information, frustration, and also a study indicated that this lack of communication can emerge as feelings of secrecy between the groups. The second other relevant consideration is the traditions in Japanese workforces. Firstly, there's a tradition of lifelong employment. Many in Japan stay in the same job for life to represent loyalty, whereas Australians have more mobility. The second one is the seniority-based wages, which I mentioned earlier. It's where people are paid more as they get older. So this slide discusses whether Oz Hotels should expand to Japan using a SWOT table. So the strengths, the Japanese are known for being extremely hardworking in nature, so they'd be good people to employ. Also, there's an emphasis on lifelong learning in Japan. Workers are studious and they'd be willing to do, the training and the development processes because they're willing to learn. Some weaknesses would be the extreme cultural differences between Australia and Japan as shown by the Hofstede dimensions that I discussed. There'd be a lot of training required and there may be a long setup time because of this training. Some opportunities would be the growing tourist popularity of Japan. In the last couple of years, it has grown greatly in the likelihood that people will travel to Japan. This means there's potential of high profit. Moreover, expats can develop their career by doing overseas placements. Lastly, some threats would be the language barrier that we've discussed. There is also the geographical distance. There will be heavy costs associated with the training development of both home and host country employees. And finally, there will be costs associated with the new performance management systems to reflect the different cultures between the employees. These next slides are just Thank you for listening to my presentation.